Close your eyes and picture this. Dawn breaking over Gettysburg, July 3rd, 1863. The fog hasn't lifted yet, but the smell has. 2 days of burnt powder still clinging to the grass, to the dead, to the men who are still breathing. 15,000 of them, farm boys from Virginia, clerks from Tennessee, sons of North Carolina who, 3 years earlier, had never fired a shot in anger. They are standing in a line, a single impossibly long line stretching almost a mile across open ground. And in a few minutes, on command, they are going to start walking, not running, not sprinting, walking, directly toward a ridge bristling with Union cannon and rifles. No zigzagging, no diving for cover, no breaking for the tree line, just walking, shoulder to shoulder, in neat straight rows, into a wall of iron and lead that could and would cut them down by the thousand. If you saw this happen today, you'd assume it was mass suicide. So why did it happen, again and again, for 4 straight years? That question is the black hole at the center of the American Civil War. A war that swallowed over 600,000 lives. A war fought at the exact moment history handed soldiers 18th century orders and 19th century weapons. And nobody told them the math had changed. Today, we're going to pull that thread all the way out, because the answer isn't stupidity. It's not blind obedience either. It's something far stranger, a collision of psychology, physics, and pure battlefield desperation that turned a suicidal walk into, at the time, the single most rational thing a soldier could do. Stick with me. By the end of this, you'll never look at a Civil War painting the same way again. To understand why men marched into cannon fire in 1863, you have to go back nearly 100 years earlier to a battlefield doctrine built around a weapon so wildly inaccurate it was practically useless one-on-one: the smoothbore musket. Think British Brown Bess. Think French Charleville. Beyond 50 yards, these things weren't rifles. They were glorified shotguns with trust issues. A single soldier aiming at a single target was, statistically, wasting his ammunition. But here's the trick European armies discovered. Stack hundreds of those inaccurate muskets shoulder to shoulder, 3 ranks deep, and fire them together. And inaccuracy stops mattering. You're no longer aiming a weapon. You're aiming a wall. This was linear warfare perfected by military minds like Frederick the Great of Prussia. And it depended on one brutal, non-negotiable ingredient: discipline. Break the line, and you weren't just losing formation. You were opening a door for enemy cavalry to come pouring through like wolves, finding a gap in the fence. Officers needed to see their men to command them. Scattered men couldn't hear orders over the chaos of battle. As one old Napoleonic-era training manual bluntly put it, the soldier must fear his officers more than he fears the enemy. That mindset didn't die in the 1700s. It marched straight into 1861, even though by then the entire technological foundation underneath it had quietly crumbled. Here's the twist that makes the whole tragedy make sense. By the time the Civil War broke out, the smoothbore musket was already a relic. Both the Union and Confederacy inherited their tactics wholesale. Winfield Scott's infantry manual, itself borrowed from French doctrine, was the shared scripture of both armies. Advance in line. Halt. Fire by rank. Advance again. But the guns in these men's hands weren't smoothbores anymore. They were rifled muskets. The Springfield Model 1855, the British Enfield, firing a devastating little piece of engineering called the Minié ball. Suddenly, accurate range didn't mean 50 yards. It meant 300 to 400. A single well-aimed shot could kill a man at a distance where, a century earlier, he'd have been perfectly safe. In other words, the tactics were frozen in the era of the shotgun, while the weapons had quietly evolved into sniper rifles. Nobody hit the brakes in time, and that mismatch is the real engine behind every horrifying casualty count of the war. So why didn't commanders simply throw out the old playbook? Because the alternative was, in its own way, even more dangerous. Marching shoulder to shoulder didn't just look organized, it felt survivable. There is deep documented psychology in the idea of safety in numbers, even when that safety is an illusion. Desertion became almost physically harder inside a tight formation. Peer pressure did what fear of death alone couldn't, and looming behind it all was the threat of execution for cowardice. Union soldier Elisha Hunt Rhodes captured this eerie mix of horror and duty in his diary after Antietam, describing an advance under heavy fire where the killing felt less like triumph and more like a grim obligation carried out among brave men on both sides. That's the emotional core of the line, not blind bravado, but a kind of fatalistic brotherhood. You didn't march because you weren't afraid. You marched because the man to your left and the man to your right were doing the same terrifying thing, and abandoning them felt like a worse death than the bullet. Now zoom out. Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant. These men weren't directing squads. They were trying to steer armies of 50 to 100,000 soldiers across miles of smoke-choked terrain with no radios, no drones, no live battlefield feed. Just horses, flags, and shouting. A tight, visible line was the only camera feed a 19th century general had. It let officers on horseback spot weak points, redirect troops, and hold an entire operation together with something resembling control. Loose, scattered skirmish formations worked fine for small harassing raids, but for a full, decisive assault meant to actually break an enemy position, mass and order were everything. Send exhausted men sprinting across open ground in heavy wool uniforms under a blazing sun, and they'd arrive at the enemy line, broken, disorganized, and easy to repel piecemeal. Here's the detail most people miss entirely. Those long, slow, deliberate advances weren't about bravado. They were about arithmetic. Reloading a rifled musket wasn't instant. It took 20 to 30 seconds. Ramrod, powder, ball, cap. A small eternity in the middle of a firefight. During that reload window, an advancing line could physically close the distance. And what were they closing the distance for? The bayonet. Despite everything you might assume, hand-to-hand steel remained the psychological trump card of Civil War combat. Only around 1% of documented wounds actually came from bayonets. But the mere threat of cold steel forced an enemy to make an impossible choice: stand and fight, or break and run. Walking, rather than sprinting, conserved the exact strength soldiers would need for that final, decisive collision. A Confederate officer at Gettysburg later recalled his men advancing at a steady, deliberate pace, not a rushed, double-quick. Precisely so, they'd have something left in reserve for the moment that mattered most. It was horrifyingly logical, and it was catastrophically expensive. If you want to see this logic collide with reality in the ugliest way possible, look at Fredericksburg, December 1862. Union General Ambrose Burnside sent wave after wave of soldiers uphill toward Mary's Heights, where Confederate troops sat entrenched behind a stone wall, raking the advancing lines with canister shot. Essentially, giant shotgun blasts fired from cannon. The Irish Brigade walked into that fire. One survivor, William McCarter, described an atmosphere thick with lead, men dropping like autumn leaves across the field. Over 12,000 Union casualties in a single day, the overwhelming majority mowed down while advancing in exactly the disciplined formation their training had drilled into them. It's one of the starkest illustrations in military history of tactics failing to keep pace with technology, and paying for it in human lives. They did adapt, eventually and painfully, slowly. As casualties mounted, enthusiasm for textbook linear assaults cooled fast. By 1864, entrenchments had become the new normal. The siege lines at Petersburg were, in hindsight, an eerie preview of the trench warfare that would define World War I 50 years later. Skirmishers began using natural cover, trees, fences, terrain folds, to screen larger advances. But wholesale reinvention was nearly impossible. You can't retrain millions of raw volunteers, many with only weeks of drilling, into an entirely new doctrine mid-war. Generals leaned on what they knew, the Napoleonic playbook that had delivered victories like Austerlitz through sheer massed force. Add to that the terrain itself. Many Civil War battlefields were wooded or rolling, which limited the effective range of that new rifled technology anyway. At Shiloh, dense forest broke tidy formations into chaos, regardless of anyone's tactical intentions. And cavalry, though weakened by the new rifles, could still punish any army foolish enough to abandon a tight formation and expose its flanks. Historian Paddy Griffith has argued the war was, in some ways, less tactically revolutionary than popular memory suggests. Smoke, stress, and sheer panic meant a lot of soldiers fired wildly or not at all, blunting the theoretical lethality of those improved rifles. Behind every statistic in this story is a teenager who wrote home the night before a battle he might not survive. Confederate Private Sam Watkins described the whistling terror of balls flying past at Chickamauga, watching men fall by the hundreds around him, and surviving multiple charges through what he could only describe as luck and the almost hypnotic pull of staying inside the line. The sense that stepping out of formation was a betrayal of something larger than himself. On the Union side, a young officer named Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., wounded 3 separate times, and later a legendary Supreme Court justice, looked back on those years as a crucible that had forever changed him, a period where the hearts of an entire generation were touched by fire. And it wasn't only soldiers who bore witness. Nurses like Clara Barton worked amid the wreckage at Antietam, tending to the shattered results of tactics built for a different century of warfare. It's tempting to brand the generals of this war as reckless butchers. And Lee's aggression at Gettysburg or Grant's grinding losses at Cold Harbor certainly invite that label. But context complicates the verdict. These men were adapting in real time within the hard limits of 19th century logistics and communication. Grant leaned on railroads to move and supply armies at unprecedented scale. Lee maneuvered with a brilliance still studied today. Yet the sheer scope of the conflict demanded decisive, large-scale engagements, and the line remained, for all its horror, the best available tool for forcing a breakthrough. By 1865, tactics had shifted further still. Sherman's march to the sea prioritized mobility and disruption over head-on confrontation. But when armies did collide directly, the old formations reasserted themselves, right up until Appomattox brought the whole bloody experiment to a close. So, was it worth it? Linear tactics ultimately won the war for the Union through sheer relentless attrition, but at a cost almost impossible to comprehend from where we sit today. They represent a war balanced precariously on a hinge point in history. Rifles replacing muskets, discipline colliding with slaughter, glory curdling into industrial-scale death. It's not a coincidence that World War I, just 50 years later, would repeat this exact tragedy on an even larger scale, with machine guns finishing what the rifled musket started. Civil War commanders weren't simply tacticians drawing lines on a map. They were gamblers, wagering thousands of lives on doctrines that valor alone could no longer justify. Even as, deep down, many of them understood that the rules of war had already changed beneath their feet. But here's the question I want to leave you with. What if those seemingly suicidal marches weren't folly at all, but the only viable path toward crushing slavery or preserving a nation, depending on which side of that field you stood? What if, in some form, every major conflict still demands that same raw, unflinching willingness to walk forward when everything in your body is screaming to run? Would you have walked the line? The fields at Gettysburg are silent now, but that question isn't. It never really left. If this pulled you in, make sure you're subscribed, because we're only getting started on the hidden logic behind history's deadliest decisions.